it's also at the center of that poem when Odysseus and Penelope finally get together. He comes into the bedroom, and their bed had been carved out of a huge tree growing up right in the middle of the island of Ithaca by their parents' generation. They've made this bed out of the tree. So there is right at the beginning of poetry is this powerful sense of heirloom, of husbandry. And then the other poem is Works and Days of Hesiod. You know, nobody reads it; they read the war poem. But the other poem it says, "You should always start planning when the first star in the Pleiades touches the horizon. You should avoid lawsuits and lawyers if you possibly can. And war is a really bad idea." It's a farmer's
and things
poem.
haven't changed.
There's a farmer's almanac right at the beginning
brilliant.
and it's very like the story you told about your dad. The connection between war and growing food. People who look up at the violence and say they're going to have to eat when it's over.
You know, it's interesting to think of current events in the context of food. What's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in all these different situations, and where does food fit into that? And it's not talked about at all. Fascinating.
And, you know, sacramentally, right at the center of life. And it's very powerful in Japanese tradition. I spent a lot of time translating Japanese poetry, and one of the most gorgeous of all haikus is about Basho, the 17th century poet is out. He takes to hiking around the country and with a couple of friends, and they stay at monasteries and earn their keep by helping with dinner. And one of the most famous of all Japanese poems is "Fall night, getting dinner, we peeled eggplants, cucumbers." That's the whole poem. That's the whole poem. And you can use it as a personal mantra for the rest of your life.
I like
Fall
that.
evening, getting dinner, we peeled eggplants, cucumbers. Is there a more sane relation to the world than,
I like that.
than preparing a meal made of real things grown from the earth?
I remember finding this ceramic plate, and it had on it, written on it around in a circle, "Apples are wonderful fruits until you've eaten a peach." I like that.
Bob, I was wondering, how has food and farming entered your work and influenced your body of work?
Food entered my work actually early on in the form of homesickness. When I was, I grew up in California, and my first job was in Buffalo, New York, and when I sat down to think what I wanted to write poetry about, the line I wrote, I think, was "a loaf of sourdough and a glass of Chardonnay." Couldn't get either sourdough or Chardonnay in those days in Buffalo, New York. Let alone tortillas. Trying to buy tortillas was really tricky. I had a family young. To have a family is the ritual of family life is to eat together. When I was working on an anthology of poetry appropriate to weddings, and one of the things, and so I thought, oh, this would be fun to look at the history of how different cultures have done this. And in most cultures, the wedding occurs when the young couple have some bread together. It survives in ours as the feeding each other the wedding cake. But there's a sacramental gesture at the center of almost every human ritual.
It makes me think of wedding planners, and the most important thing at a wedding reception is the food. Remember that.
So I have a question about these blossoms, which I hope you'll all come up and look at close once, because this is where it begins, right? Is pollination an issue? Pollinators an issue?
Peaches, it's interesting. Peaches, most stone fruit, peaches, plum, peaches and nectarines are self-pollinating. So they don't necessarily need bees. However, there's some research done that on, and they did it ironically on organic farms, that they found that if bees are high populations in a peach orchard, the quality of the peaches are better. And I do think, and we on our farm, because we have a lot of blooming nectar sources, bees are all over the place. We started a native bee project on our farm, and native bees are very, very different. They tend to be solitary. They tend to burrow in the ground, so you have to have open fields for them to make their homes, and they're very tiny. But they do work our trees, and I do think it contributes to our quality. So in the way our peaches self-pollinating, yes and no, I would like to think it's those ecosystems of life, which include native bee population, that make a difference. It's the secret of our farm. So, but anyway, and these are. And
someone brought these. Emily brought these from the edible schoolyard, and we think they're crab apple blossoms.
They're gorgeous.
They're just very gorgeous. Beautiful. Yeah. On the subject of drought, and I just want to point this most recent copy of New California Writing, an annual of the best literary writing about our state. There's an essay by Mass about climate change and drought and being a farmer.
Yeah. And it's interesting, later this week there's a statewide conference of water resource directors. So it's a really kind of governmental, wonky, political policy, conference. And they're asking me to give a keynote address. And I'm going to tell them about somewhat we talked about today. How do you tell a good story? Because the story of drought and how it's unfolding right now is going to dictate policy. Yeah. And so it's unfolding right in front of us too, because the drought is here, and what impact does it have? And is it just economics that drive this story of drought? And I don't think it is. So what kind of story does it tell? Do we want to shift?
Yes, I think it's time to invite all of you to join the conversation.
Sure, right here.
Hi, so I have two questions. The first one is a simpler question. So when you were talking about heirloom, the first thing I thought of was heirloom tomatoes. And I was just wondering, because when I think of heirloom tomatoes, it's just another variety. I'm not thinking about, taking the past, moving it to the present. So I was just wondering where that term, heirloom tomato, came from. If